Professor Sorensen, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, and I can happily say friends. There's so many friends in the audience. It's a real pleasure to be here. Thank you for giving me the honor of speaking to the inaugural session of the third in a series of Asian relations conferences on transforming South Asia imperative for action. You have a very impressive list of participants and an exhaustive and full agenda. And I'm sure that your conference will contribute meaningfully to the transformation that South Asia is already undergoing at present. I thought that what I would do was to speak on the present situation in South Asia in both economic and political and security terms, and then maybe make a few points about what the way forward might be. We in South Asia tend to be modest, which I suppose is a good thing, but we also tend to underestimate ourselves, which is not such a good thing when we speak of South Asian integration and the present situation in this sub-region. We often speak of a South Asian paradox, that a region which has so many cultural and other affinities should be so lacking in integration and connectivity. My own view is the minority one, and some of you have heard me say this before, that there is much more to what is happening in South Asia today than the by now traditional narrative of pessimism, which we South Asians ourselves are the main retailers of. Because the narrative goes something like this, and you see it over and over again, that South Asia is one of the least integrated regions in the world with itself and with the rest of the world. It's also one of the regions most beset by irreconcilable political and security issues and disputes. With 22% of the world's population, it has only 6 to 7% of the world's GDP. Intra-regional trade accounts for only 6% of its total foreign trade. It's resource poor, and it only has about 8.3% of water resources, etc., etc., etc. You know the story. We've all heard this over and over again. All of which may be true, but it misses the point that reality is far more complex in South Asia than this story. That the empirical performance by South Asia, if you look over the last decade, has actually shown that we know how to deal with these limitations, that we're heading in the right direction, and that we have a moment in history where I think if we seize our opportunities, we can continue the transformation of South Asia that has already begun. Let's first look at the economies, and why do I say this? South Asia has emerged as one of the fastest growing sub-regions in the world, with an average rate of growth of 8% sustained over the past 5 years. Intra-regional trade within South Asia has begun to grow and has doubled over the past 5 years. We are therefore at a point where it is increasingly evident to everybody in South Asia, and this is true across all the countries, that there are substantial costs to not moving forward by lowering tariffs, removing non-tariff barriers, and minimizing sensitive lists. Each government in South Asia has taken significant actions in the very recent past towards this. India reduced the sensitive list under SAFTA last year for LDCs in a dramatic fashion. And I'm told that the result is there to see that, for instance, Bangladesh's exports to India by July will cross $1 billion in the 12-month period for the first time ever in history. The India-Sri Lanka FTA is well known, has already quadrupled trade between India and Sri Lanka. Pakistan has decided to grant India most favored nation treatment and is gradually going to move towards a negative list system. And I could cite numerous other examples of bilateral, multilateral actions that South Asian governments have taken in the recent past along the same lines. When we speak of South Asia as the least integrated region, for instance, we ignore the wide variation in our experiences. The fact is that intra-regional trade as a proportion of our total trade varies widely for the countries in South Asia. For Nepal, it's as high as 60.5% of their total foreign trade. For Sri Lanka, it's around 18.9%. For Pakistan, 6.6%. And for India, a very low 2.7%. But this variation also tells us how great the potential is and why intra-regional trade is growing faster than South Asia's trade with the rest of the world. The other caveat that we should bear in mind, if we are honest with ourselves, is that official figures certainly underestimate the real magnitude of trade that is taking place between South Asian countries, whether clandestinely or through third countries. Anecdotal evidence suggests that the real figure for India-Pakistan trade could be almost 3 times greater than the official trade figures of about $3 billion a year. It's an open secret that most India-Bangladesh trade is not reflected in the official figures. South Asia has dubious distinction of a relatively high level of informal trade flows, unrecorded and unreflected in our official statistics. And this suggests that natural complementarities do exist between South Asian economies and that they have already been identified and acted upon, maybe not by the government, but by everybody else. Several years ago, in 1999, RIS carried out a study of the costs of non-cooperation in SAARC. They found that in 1994, I think it was, if I remember rightly, Sri Lanka and Pakistan had imported many items at a higher unit value cost than from the rest of the world than if they had actually sourced them in South Asia, paying on an average twice of what they would have paid in South Asia, and losing, and remember this is in the 90s, $266 million in the case of Sri Lanka and about $511 million in the case of Pakistan. These were relatively high values for that time. If anything, the costs of not doing business with each other have risen since then. Products are being exported by countries in the region to the rest of the world, but not to other countries in the region who are buying the same products from elsewhere. But I think there is today a much wider realization of the costs, of these costs, the costs of not doing business with each other, than within the region than before. And I think it's probably time that one or the other academic institution in South Asia did an updated version of this, and we looked at what these costs are. The other opportunity, of course, comes from the fact that our economies have diversified and become much more sophisticated in the last decade. And therefore, similarities in production structures across countries also offer opportunities for intra-industry trade. Now, this is counterintuitive. We're not used to this situation because it's really happened quite recently. But there are several sectors, whether processed foods, textiles, rubber products, plastics, pharmaceuticals, apparel, light engineering goods, where this kind of trade, of intra-industry trade, across up the value chain could really make sense. And this is what businessmen are saying to us. But I think it's we, whether academics or government, I think we are a little slower at recognizing what the businessmen themselves are saying to us. As for the argument of the naysayers that South Asia is resource poor, that we are doomed perhaps to even conflict over resources, we also have a whole series of strengths. Mr. Devre just mentioned some of them. But the biggest strength, I think, is that we are population rich and we have a good demographic profile. which should last well into the 21st century, giving us markets and the demand that we need to keep growing. And if you think of it, despite all these so-called constraints, we have maintained a very healthy growth momentum in the recent past. But I can see many of you looking skeptical and thinking to yourselves, this is all very well, all this economics, but this ignores the real political and the security issues that we have among us, which enable outsiders to say that this is one of the most dangerous places on earth. So you probably are saying, yes, we got the economics right recently, but can we do the politics? My answer to that is perhaps. I mean, I'm not going to say no, because I think we've proven over time that we can do the politics right. But I'm not going to say yes either, because there are things that we need to do and that we need to do together before we can get a categorical yes as an answer. There's no question, South Asia has more than its fair share of insurgencies, radicalism, terrorism, extremism. But none of these has prevented South Asia from being one of the fastest growing subregions in the world in the last decade, and from outperforming most other subregions. But it's an open question whether we have the institutions, the habits of working together,